My name is David, and I never thought I'd be saying this. I was a teacher, someone who believed in facts, in history, in things that could be proven. But what I experienced, there's no textbook that could have prepared me for it. I died. One moment I was driving home from school, thinking about a conversation I had with one of my students, a question about Black history that I didn't have an answer for. I told myself I'd look into it later, but I never got the chance. Because in an instant, everything went black. And just like that, I was gone. But death wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Because in that place, where time didn't exist, where my body no longer mattered, I was shown something. A truth that had been buried. A history that had been erased. A reality that we were never supposed to see. What I saw changed everything. And now I have to share it. Because once you hear this, you'll never see the world the same way again. I never thought much about the routine of my days. If you had asked me to describe my life before that moment, I probably would have called it ordinary, predictable. Nothing out of the ordinary, really. Just the usual cycle of waking up, going to work, coming home, grading papers, and preparing for the next day. But now, looking back, I realize how much I took for granted. Every morning started the same way. The alarm on my phone would go off at 5:45 a.m., always set to some upbeat song that was supposed to make waking up easier. It never really worked. I'd slap the snooze button a couple of times, staring up at the ceiling, debating whether I could steal just 5 more minutes before dragging myself out of bed. The house was quiet. Too quiet, honestly. I had been divorced for about 5 years, and my son Marcus was off at college now. It was just me and the silence. Some days I didn't mind it. Other days it felt heavier than I wanted to admit. I'd shuffle into the kitchen, set the coffee machine to brew, and glance at the pile of ungraded essays sitting on the table. I told myself I'd get to them later, probably during lunch or after school. The truth was, I loved teaching, but grading, that was the part I always put off. After showering and getting dressed, always in a button-up shirt and slacks, because despite how casual the world had become, I still believed in looking professional. I'd grab my coffee and head out the door by 6:45 a.m. The drive to school was about 20 minutes. Long enough to think, but not long enough to get lost in my thoughts. I had taken the same route for years, past the corner store where I sometimes stopped for a second coffee, past the gas station where I always meant to fill up my tank before it hit empty, past the row of houses with perfectly manicured lawns that I sometimes imagined myself living in. Most mornings, I'd listen to a podcast, sometimes history, sometimes education, sometimes just background noise to keep my mind occupied. But that particular morning, I remember driving in silence, not out of choice, but because I had forgotten to charge my phone overnight, and it had died just as I was pulling out of my driveway. Maybe that was the first sign that the day would be different. Teaching had never been just a job for me. It was something I truly cared about. I taught history, not just dates and events, but the stories behind them. I wanted my students to see history as something alive, something that still shaped their world. My classroom was my domain. Room 214. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. Posters of historical figures lined the walls. Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, George Washington, and Martin Luther King Jr. I kept an old chalkboard at the front of the room, even though we had digital projectors now. Something about writing in chalk just made history feel more tangible. And then there was my desk, cluttered with papers, books, and little notes from students over the years. Some were thank you notes, some were doodles they had snuck onto my desk when they thought I wouldn't notice. One, from a student years ago, still sat framed beside my coffee mug. "Mr. Carter, you make history make sense. thank you for teaching me things I never knew. That was why I did it. That was why I got up every morning, why I put in the extra hours, why I stayed after school to help students who needed it. Because history wasn't just about the past. It was about understanding who we are and where we came from. My first period class was always half asleep when they walked in. Teenagers at 7:30 a.m. weren't exactly the most energetic bunch. They'd slump into their seats, earbuds still in, scrolling through their phones until I made them put them away. I'd usually start class with a question, something to make them think. If you could go back in time and change one historical event, what would it be? Do you think history is written by the winners, or is there more to it than that? Most days the responses were predictable. World War II, slavery, the civil rights movement. But every once in a while, a student would surprise me with an answer that made me pause. Those were the moments I lived for. And then there were the students who stayed after class, sometimes to ask for help, sometimes just to talk. There was Marcus, a quiet kid who always sat in the back, but had the sharpest insights when he did speak. There was Jasmine, who wanted to be a lawyer, but doubted she was smart enough. She absolutely was. There was Chris, who struggled with reading but never gave up. I saw so much potential in them, so much possibility. And then there was her. I remember the moment so clearly now. 5th period, just after lunch. The class was discussing Reconstruction, what happened after slavery was abolished, how the country tried and failed to rebuild. That's when she raised her hand. Her name was Ayana. She was one of my brightest students, always questioning, always pushing deeper. But this time her question wasn't just curiosity, it was something more. Mr. Carter, why don't we ever learn about the black people who fought back, the ones who had power? The room went silent. Not because it was a bad question, because it was too good of a question. I opened my mouth to respond, but for a moment I hesitated. Because the truth was, I knew the answer. I knew about the stories that had been buried, the histories that had been rewritten, the names that had been erased. But saying it out loud, in a classroom, in a school that had already warned teachers about being too political, I couldn't lie to her, so I told her the truth. Because history isn't just about what happened, it's about who gets to tell the story. She frowned. So, does that mean there's a whole history we don't know? I nodded slowly, and that was the moment everything changed. Because in that instant, I could see it in her eyes. The realization, the hunger for more. She wasn't just asking for herself, she was asking for all of them, for every student who had ever sat in a classroom and felt like they were only getting half the truth. And deep down, I knew. This wasn't just an ordinary day. I just didn't realize how much it would cost me. The day had been long, but good. After my last class, I spent an extra hour in my classroom, grading assignments and going over tomorrow's lesson plan. The question Ayana asked still lingered in my mind. Why don't we learn about the black people who had power? I had always been careful about how I framed things in the classroom, pushing just far enough to make my students think, but not far enough to get called into another concerned conversation with administration. But this was different. It gnawed at me in a way I couldn't shake. By the time I packed up my things and left the building, the hallways were nearly empty. A few students lingered outside, waiting for their rides, laughing and talking. A couple of teachers waved goodbye as they headed to their cars. It was just another normal afternoon. I got into my car, tossing my bag into the passenger seat. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I took one last glance at the school in my rearview mirror. I had no idea it would be the last time I ever saw it. The drive home was second nature. I had taken this same route for years, past the library, past the little convenience store where I sometimes stopped for snacks, past the old church with the broken bell tower. It was a route so familiar that I barely even thought about it. That's why, at first, I didn't notice the car. Maybe I should have seen it coming. The car had been behind me since I left the school parking lot, keeping its distance but never falling too far behind. I remember glancing in my rearview mirror at a stoplight, something about the way the headlights hovered in the distance making me uneasy. But I told myself I was being paranoid. I turned onto a quieter street, one of those long, empty stretches of road that made up the outskirts of town. Streetlights were sparse, and most businesses were already closed for the night. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows over the pavement. That's when I noticed the car again. Closer this time. Something about it sent a chill up my spine. I gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, my heartbeat picking up. I wasn't usually the type to get spooked, but there was an instinctual feeling in my gut, one I couldn't shake. Then, without warning, the headlights behind me swerved. There wasn't time to react as a blinding set of headlights filled my side mirror, too close, too fast. Then, a sudden, violent force slammed into the back of my car. My body jerked forward, my seatbelt tightening like a vice around my chest. For a moment, everything spun. The world blurred as my car veered off the road, skidding uncontrollably. I tried to grip the wheel, tried to correct the spin, but it was useless. The front of my car crashed into something solid, the force rattling through my bones. My head snapped forward, colliding with the steering wheel before my airbag exploded into my face. Pain. Blinding, sharp pain. My ears rang, my vision swam. For a moment, I couldn't tell up from down. I tried to move. Nothing. My body felt heavy, pinned in place by some invisible force. The smell of gasoline and burning rubber filled my nose, thick and suffocating. Somewhere in the distance, I thought I heard the faint sound of a car speeding away, leaving me there, alone. I don't know how much time passed before the pain dulled into something deeper, something colder. My breath came in shallow gasps, each one harder than the last. My fingers tingled, then went numb. I tried to focus on something, anything, but my vision was fading. Darkness crept in at the edges. I remember thinking, this can't be happening, but it was. I was dying. I could feel it. I always thought death would come with a warning, a flash of my life before my eyes, a moment of clarity, something. But there was no final realization, no epiphany, just the slow, terrifying certainty that I wasn't going to make it. And then, something shifted. The pain faded. Not completely, but enough that I knew something was happening. I tried to move my hand, to reach for my phone, to call for help, but my fingers barely twitched. The weight on my chest grew heavier, like the air itself was pressing down on me. Then I heard it. A voice. Not a human voice, not a paramedic, not some good Samaritan stopping to help. Something else. It wasn't coming from outside the car. It was coming from everywhere. Deep, resonant, powerful. A voice that shook something inside me. I wanted to speak, to ask who or what it was. But before I could, the darkness swallowed me whole, and I was gone. I expected death to feel like an ending, a sharp cut to black, a void swallowing me whole. But instead, I was floating. The pain was gone. The pressure in my chest, the burning in my lungs, the weight of my broken body. It had all faded. At first I thought I was dreaming, but then I saw it. My car, twisted metal, shattered glass. The hood crumpled like paper against a concrete barrier. Smoke curled into the night air, thick and ghostly. And inside was me, slumped over the steering wheel, unmoving. Blood matted my hair, trickled down my temple. It didn't make sense. How could I be looking at myself? Panic surged through me. I tried to move, to call out, to do something, but my body wasn't responding, because I wasn't in it anymore. The world felt eerily still. The distant hum of the city was gone. No car engines, no voices, no sirens rushing to the scene. Just silence, thick and absolute. I hovered there, suspended in something that wasn't air, wasn't space, wasn't anything I could name. There was no sense of gravity, no up or down. I simply was. Then I heard it, a whisper, so faint I barely caught it. David. My name. It came from nowhere and everywhere at once, curling around me like a breath of wind. I turned, or at least I felt myself turn. Movement was different now, effortless and fluid, as if I were thought rather than flesh. And then I saw them. They stood at the edge of the wreckage, just beyond the reach of the flickering streetlights. Shadowy figures. Not quite human, but not entirely inhuman either. Their shapes wavered, shifting in and out of focus, like smoke caught in a draft. I couldn't see their faces, but I felt their eyes, watching, waiting. A shiver ran through me, if I even had a body left to feel it. Something about them was wrong, not just unfamiliar, but wrong in a way that sent a deep, primal warning through me. They weren't here to help, and I knew, instinctively, that they had been waiting for me. Panic clawed at me. Was this it? Was this death? Floating above my broken body while these things lurked in the shadows, waiting to claim whatever was left of me. No. This wasn't right. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. I tried to move away from them, but the moment I did, something shifted. A pull. Not a physical force, but something deeper, more absolute. It yanked at my very essence, dragging me backward, away from the wreckage, away from the figures, away from everything. I fought it. Instinct screamed at me to resist, but I was weightless, powerless. A leaf caught in an unseen current. The world around me stretched, blurred, twisted, and then light, blinding, all-consuming light. It swallowed me whole, erasing the shadows, erasing everything. And in that light, I felt something I hadn't since the moment my car was struck. Peace. I don't know how long I drifted. Time felt meaningless. There was no hunger, no fear, no urgency. Just the endless golden warmth that cradled me like a long-forgotten lullaby. Memories flickered through my mind, but not in a linear way. They came like waves, overlapping, merging, scenes from childhood, moments of joy, heartbreak, love. I saw my mother's face, laughing as she chased me through the backyard when I was 6. I saw the first time I stood in front of a classroom, nervously gripping my lesson plan. I saw Ayana's eyes, wide with curiosity, as she asked, "Why don't we learn about the black people who had power?" That question. Even here, even now, it echoed inside me. I knew somehow that it mattered, that it was part of why I was here. And then, a presence. I didn't see him at first. I felt him, a presence so vast, so overwhelming, that it made the golden light around me seem pale in comparison. It wasn't just warmth. It was something deeper, something that reached into the very core of my being. And then I saw him. Or rather, I knew him. His form was both familiar and impossible to fully grasp. He radiated light, not just surrounded by it, but made of it, as if the very essence of existence flowed through him. I had no doubt. This was Jesus, not the painted figure from Sunday school, not a distant historical idea. He was real, standing before me, looking at me, and in his gaze I felt everything, every mistake, every moment of doubt, every hidden fear I had ever buried deep inside myself. But there was no condemnation, only understanding, only love. Tears, if I still had tears, welled inside me. I didn't deserve this. I wanted to speak, to say something, to ask something, but before I could, Jesus raised his hand. And the moment he did, my mind flooded with images, visions, truths I had never known, truths the world had hidden. And what I saw next changed everything. As I stood in the presence of Jesus, or maybe stood wasn't the right word, there was no ground beneath me, no sky above, just endless radiant light stretching in all directions. It wasn't harsh or blinding. It was warmth, clarity, something I felt more than I saw. And yet, despite all of this, the only thing I could focus on was him, Jesus. I had spent my whole life hearing his name, in passing, in history books, in Sunday morning sermons I barely paid attention to. I had thought of him as an idea, a religious figure that people worshipped but never truly met. But now there was no question. He was real, and he was looking right at me. His eyes, if they could even be called that, held something indescribable, not just knowledge, but knowing, as if he saw everything, every thought I'd ever had, every regret I'd ever buried deep inside myself. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. Not because I was afraid, but because for the first time in my existence I felt truly seen. And then he spoke. "The world has lied to you." His voice wasn't a sound. Not exactly. It resonated through me, as if my very soul was hearing him rather than my ears. "David," he said. I had heard my name spoken thousands of times before, but never like this. Never with such weight, such certainty. "There is something you must see." The moment he said it, the light around us shifted. It bent and twisted, forming images, memories. No, not mine. They belonged to the world itself. And suddenly, I wasn't just standing in the presence of Jesus anymore. I was somewhere else. The first thing I noticed was the sky, a deep, endless blue, untouched by pollution, unscarred by time. Below it stretched a city, no, a kingdom, unlike anything I had ever seen. Beautiful, simple structures gleamed in the sunlight, built with an artistry that defied logic. The people, dark-skinned, regal, moving with a grace and confidence that spoke of generations of wisdom, walked streets paved with stone, lined with markets brimming with goods I couldn't even name. It was breathtaking, it was powerful, and it was ancient. I didn't know how I knew, but I did. This was a place that existed long before the world I had known, a civilization rich with its own history, art, medicine, philosophy, far more advanced than what history had ever taught. And yet, I had never seen this in any textbook, never heard it mentioned in any lecture. Why? Because history had erased them. The thought struck me like a blow. This was Africa. But not the Africa I had been shown in school, not the continent constantly depicted as impoverished, struggling, in need of saving. This was something else, something the world had deliberately hidden. And as I watched, I knew this was only the beginning. The vision shifted. The city, once thriving, was now under siege. Foreign invaders arrived, not as lost wanderers seeking trade, but as conquerors. They came with weapons, with greed, with an insatiable hunger for power. I watched as they took everything: knowledge, resources, people. They tore families apart, shackled the hands that once built monuments, silenced the voices that once spoke truth. But worse than the physical destruction was what followed: lies. I saw history being rewritten. Kings and queens reduced to nameless slaves, brilliant minds erased from existence, an entire lineage stripped of its identity. The world didn't just steal from them, it buried them. And then it rewrote the story. I felt anger rise inside me, a deep, burning injustice that I had never known before. Why wasn't I taught this? I asked. Jesus looked at me, his expression full of both sorrow and understanding. Because those who hold power fear the truth. The vision shifted again, and suddenly I was back in my own time. Modern-day classrooms, rows of students sitting at their desks, staring at whitewashed textbooks. The same stories, repeated over and over. The Founding Fathers, the Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution. But the real history, the stories of the black men and women who shaped civilization itself, was missing. No mention of the great libraries of Timbuktu, where scholars from across the world once gathered to study. No mention of Imhotep, the African genius whose medical practices predated Hippocrates by thousands of years. No mention of the warriors, the leaders, the philosophers who built dynasties. It had all been reduced to chains and suffering, as if black history began with slavery instead of starting civilizations themselves. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't, because this wasn't just a mistake. It was deliberate. I turned to Jesus, my chest tight with emotion. "What am I supposed to do with this?" I asked. For the first time, his gaze grew heavy. "You must tell them." The weight of those words settled over me, because I knew if I spoke about this, if I revealed what I had seen, I would face resistance. People wouldn't want to hear it. They would deny it. They would fight it. "They won't believe me," I whispered. Jesus stepped closer, and when he spoke again, his voice was both gentle and unshakable. The truth does not need permission to be known. It only needs a voice willing to speak it. The light around me began to fade. The warmth, the peace, the presence of Jesus. It all started pulling away like a tide retreating back into the ocean. No, I wasn't ready to leave. "Wait," I begged. "I have more questions." But Jesus only smiled, and then darkness, cold, pain. I gasped as air flooded my lungs, my body jerking violently. Sound rushed in all at once, the blare of ambulance sirens, voices shouting, the sharp sting of shattered glass digging into my skin. I was back, alive. But I wasn't the same, because I had seen the truth, and now I had no choice but to share it. I woke up to the sound of voices, urgent, desperate. A crushing weight pressed against my chest, rhythmic and forceful. 1, 2, 3, 4. The voice counted, each beat driving into me like a hammer. I gasped. Air rushed into my lungs like fire, like I had been drowning and just surfaced. Blurred faces hovered above me, paramedics. One of them let out a breath of relief. He's back. The world around me flickered in and out. Sirens wailed in the distance. Lights from an ambulance flashed red and blue against the night sky. I tried to move, but my entire body felt wrong. "You were gone for 5 minutes," a voice said, barely registering through the haze. 5 minutes. My heart had stopped. I should have been dead. But I wasn't, and deep down I knew why. Jesus had sent me back, not just to live, to speak. But from the moment I tried, I realized something. Something or someone didn't want me to. The first time I tried to talk about what happened, I was still in the hospital. A nurse had asked me if I remembered anything from the accident. I hesitated, debating whether I should say it out loud. And then I did. "I saw something. No, someone." I told her about the light, the presence, the vision of history I had been shown. Her expression changed immediately. Polite smile, but stiff, uncomfortable. She patted my arm and said, "You've been through a lot. Sometimes the brain creates things to cope." Dismissed, like it was nothing, like I was nothing. But I knew what I saw, and when I finally returned to work, I decided I wasn't going to stay silent. After my first day back, I was called into the principal's office. He smiled, but his tone was sharp. "David, we're all relieved that you're okay. But we've had some Concerns. Concerns, I echoed. He folded his hands over the desk. Some students mentioned you've been talking about your accident and about certain topics that might not be appropriate for a classroom setting. I felt my stomach tighten. You mean history? I mean controversial history, he corrected. I stared at him. You mean the truth? He sighed. Look, I'm just trying to help you. There are parents involved now, and the school board. If this continues, it could become a bigger issue. It wasn't a warning. It was a clear message. Shut up, or we'll shut you down. I didn't shut up. And within days, the backlash started. It began with whispers in the hallways, then emails from concerned parents, then full-blown protests. I pulled into the school parking lot one morning to find them standing outside, signs in hand. Stop indoctrinating our kids. No politics in the classroom. Fire Mr. Carter. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, my pulse pounding in my ears. These were the same parents who had no problem with whitewashed history, the same ones who never batted an eye when the curriculum skipped over entire centuries of black achievement. But now that the truth was being spoken, it was suddenly a problem. I stepped out of my car. Immediately, eyes turned toward me. Someone muttered, "There he is." A woman marched up to me, her face flushed with anger. You have no right to be teaching our kids your version of history. It's not my version, I said. It's the truth. No, it's an agenda, she snapped. I opened my mouth to respond, but then I saw her son, one of my students, standing behind her, head down, silent, like he wanted to speak, but couldn't. And I realized this wasn't just about me. This was about all the students who had been denied the truth. All the students who had been taught to stay silent. But I couldn't stay silent. Not now. Not after what I had seen. Then came the messages. They flooded my inbox, my social media, even my email. Some were just insults. You're a fraud. Nobody cares about your fake vision. Get over yourself. But others were worse. We know where you live. Watch your back, Carter. You should have stayed dead. Racist slurs, death threats, warnings to stop speaking before it was too late. I knew exactly what they wanted. They wanted me scared, silent, but they didn't realize something. I had already faced death. I had already seen the other side. And if they thought fear was enough to stop me, they were wrong. It wasn't just people trying to silence me. It was something else. It started with small things. Lights flickering when I spoke about my experience. Phone calls from unknown numbers. Silence on the other end. And then the voices. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. A faint whisper as I was falling asleep. A murmur when I was home alone. But then, one night, I heard it clearly. Stop. It came from the corner of my bedroom. I froze, heart hammering. I turned my head slowly. Nothing was there, but the air was thick, suffocating. And in that moment, I knew. This wasn't just about history. This was about something bigger. Because I wasn't just uncovering forgotten truths. I was unraveling a lie that had been carefully constructed for centuries. And whatever had built that lie, it wasn't going down without a fight. I closed my eyes, forcing the fear out. And then, his voice, clear and steady, washed over me. Do not be afraid. It washed over me like warmth, like light cutting through the darkness. I took a breath, opened my eyes. The presence was gone, but the message was clear. I had a choice, give in to fear or fight. I knew what I had to do, and I wouldn't stop. Not now, not ever. I knew the resistance would only get worse. I just didn't know how violent it would get. Not just from the world around me, angry parents, threats from strangers, whispers behind my back. But what I discovered next confirmed everything. I started digging deeper, researching, cross-referencing everything I had seen with historical records. And what I found? It made me sick. Entire civilizations erased, African scholars credited to white historians, religious figures rewritten to fit a narrative that excluded the very people who birthed the faith. Even Jesus himself, depicted for centuries as a pale, blue-eyed figure, when historical evidence proved he looked nothing like that. The world had been fed lies for generations, and no one questioned it, because questioning it meant disrupting everything. It meant accountability. It meant facing the uncomfortable truth that history was not what we were told, and that terrified people. I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the pages of notes I had gathered. I knew too much now. I couldn't unsee it. But the question wasn't whether or not I believed. It was whether I was willing to face what came next. Because Jesus had warned me. They will try to silence you. They will call you a liar, a fool, a threat. But you must speak anyway. I thought about the shadow, the strange calls, the people suddenly turning against me. I wasn't just risking my reputation, I was risking everything. But if I stayed silent, then the lie would win, and I couldn't let that happen. At school, the pressure reached a boiling point. A week after my return, I walked into the teacher's lounge, only for the room to go dead silent. Eyes avoided mine. Muffled conversations, like I was already a ghost. Then, the principal called me in again. This time, he was in a sour mood than before. "David, we have no choice. The school board has decided to place you on administrative leave." "For what?" "For disrupting the learning environment." I felt my stomach drop. Disrupting, for teaching history, for telling the truth, for making students uncomfortable with topics that aren't in the curriculum. I clenched my fists. What exactly made them uncomfortable, the history itself or the fact that they were never taught it? His expression tightened. "This isn't up for debate. You're being removed, effective immediately." Fired. For telling the truth, I should have been furious. But the only thing I felt was certainty. Because now I knew. The world wasn't ready for the truth. But it didn't matter. I was going to tell it anyway. The school, the media, the people who wanted everything to stay exactly as it was. They all tried to keep me quiet, but I couldn't ignore what I saw. I wouldn't. So I started speaking. At first, I thought I could go through the right channels. Maybe if I found the right historian, the right professor, the right journalist, someone, they'd listen. I reached out to educators. I emailed history departments. I contacted organizations that claimed to focus on racial justice, black history, and education. I begged them to hear me out. Most never responded. The few that did, they either dismissed me entirely or told me I was misinterpreting what I saw, that I must have been confused. One historian even laughed and said, "Visions aren't exactly peer-reviewed." I wanted to scream. It wasn't a vision, it wasn't a dream, it was the truth, and nobody wanted to touch it. If the institutions wouldn't listen, I'd find the people who would. I started small with a blog. I wrote everything I could remember, every detail, every name, every piece of history I had been shown. I cross-checked what I saw with hidden records, with oral histories passed down in black communities, with the few scholars brave enough to document what mainstream history ignored. I put it all out there. And at first, it seemed there was no progress, no shares, no comments, no engagement, like I was screaming into the void. But then, slowly, people started finding it. Messages trickled in. a college student who said my posts made him question everything he was learning in school. A mother who thanked me for helping her teach her kids the real history she never got to learn. An elder from an African community who told me, "You saw what our ancestors have been trying to tell us for generations." I cried that night, because for the first time I wasn't alone. Writing wasn't enough. I needed to be there, in the communities whose history had been stolen. So I started volunteering. I worked with African cultural centers, helping kids learn the history their textbooks ignored. I sat with elders, listening to the stories that had been passed down for centuries, stories that lined up exactly with what I saw. I traveled to African American communities where descendants of enslaved people still carried pieces of their ancestors' knowledge, traditions, languages, spiritual practices that had survived despite every effort to erase them. And everywhere I went, I told them my story. Some people looked at me with skepticism, some with curiosity, but others nodded as if they already knew, as if something deep inside them had been waiting to hear this. But the more I spoke, the harder the pushback came. Online trolls flooded my blog with hate. They called me a race betrayer for promoting African history, not my white heritage. People called me a liar, a fraud, and a self-hating anti-white race baiter. Even some black people accused me of making it up. Why would you get this message? Why not one of us? I understood their doubt. I wasn't angry. I was just heartbroken. I wasn't claiming to own this truth. I was just trying to share what was shown to me, because everyone deserved to know. But truth is dangerous, and the closer I got to sharing with a wider audience, the more they fought to bury it again. My accounts got flagged, shadow banned, even deleted. My emails were hacked. At one point, I even started getting phone calls, anonymous numbers from people warning me to stop. I don't know where this journey will end. I don't know if I'll ever reach a point where the truth is fully restored, where the history I saw is finally recognized for what it is. But I do know one thing: I'll never stop fighting for it, because now I see the pattern. Every time history gets buried, there are always people who dig it back up. And maybe that's my role now. Maybe that's our role. To keep digging, to keep remembering, to refuse to let them erase what was never theirs to erase in the first place. Because once you know the truth, you can't go back. You shouldn't go back. And if they don't want us to know it, that's all the more reason to never stop looking for the truth. If you're hearing this, it's not by accident. You were meant to hear it. Because what I saw, the truth that was revealed to me, was never lost. It was erased on purpose, by people who knew exactly what they were doing. I used to think history was just history, facts, events, things that happened. But that's a lie. History isn't just recorded, it's controlled, it's shaped, it's rewritten, and the pieces that don't fit, they're buried, ripped from textbooks, labeled as controversial, turned into secrets. And the worst part, most people don't even realize it's happening. But now you do. You know something has been taken from us, from all of us. And I'm not asking you to take my word for it. I want you to question everything I've said. I want you to research, to dig deeper, to look for the history they told you didn't exist. Because the more you look, the more you'll see. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Always remember that yes, it might just be about the African Americans, but tomorrow it could be you, it could be me, it could be any race. This isn't just about the past, it's about right now. We're at a crossroads, a moment in time where we either reclaim the truth or let it be buried forever. And that choice? It's not just in the hands of the people in power, it's in yours. Because once you know the truth, you have to make a decision. Will you stay silent, or will you speak? I know this much. They don't want you to know. They never did. They worked to keep this hidden. They fought to erase it. But now you know. And once the truth is in your hands, the only question left is, what will you do with it?